Today, we are jumping into one of the most chaotic and transformative periods in all of American history. We're talking about the 30 years from the end of World War II all the way to the Watergate scandal, a time that completely reshaped what it meant to be an American.
All right, so here's how we're going to break it all down. We're going to move chronologically through 5 major acts. First, we'll look at the post-war paranoia of the Red Scare. Then, we'll see the very first challenges to segregation. After that, the civil rights movement just explodes onto the scene. That energy spreads, and soon it feels like the whole nation is protesting something. And we'll wrap it all up with the crisis that was Watergate.
So our story kicks off in 1945. The war is over, America is victorious, but that feeling of celebration doesn't last long. It's quickly replaced by a deep-seated suspicion. The U.S. and the Soviet Union went from being allies to bitter rivals in the Cold War. And that fear of communism started to turn inward, with Americans looking for enemies within their own borders.
This timeline really just shows you how fast everything changed. I mean, look at this. The war ends in 45. Just 2 years later, you've got the Truman Doctrine to fight communism abroad, and the House Un-American Activities Committee, or HRAC, starting to investigate Americans at home. By 1950, Senator McCarthy is making wild allegations, and bam, the Red Scare is in full force.
And if you want to understand just how widespread this paranoia was, get a load of this number. Over 3 million federal employees were investigated for being disloyal. 3 million! And thousands of them were fired or felt forced to resign, many times with zero actual evidence against them. It was a terrifying time.
And the face of this whole movement was Senator Joseph McCarthy. He basically launched this infamous witch hunt, using his power to make all these baseless accusations against people from all walks of life. You know, his tactics were so infamous that they actually coined a new word for it, McCarthyism. It became shorthand for political persecution.
Okay, so while a big part of America was obsessed with finding communists, a much older, deeper wound in the country was starting to get some serious attention. The 1950s, this is where we see the beginning of a real, organized fight against racial segregation.
And the decade was just packed with these absolutely critical moments. You've got the massive legal victory with Brown v. Board of Education, then the horrific murder of Emmett Till, which just shocked the conscience of the nation, the incredible year-long protest of the Montgomery bus boycott, and of course, the bravery of the Little Rock Nine. Every single one of these was a huge deal.
Let's just pause on Brown v. Board for a moment, because this was nothing short of a legal earthquake. The Supreme Court said unanimously that the idea of separate but equal was a lie, that separate schools were inherently unequal. This decision literally ripped the legal justification for segregation right out from under the system. The fight on the ground was just getting started, but the legal battle had been won.
Now let's jump into the 1960s, because this is where everything that was simmering in the 50s just boils over. It becomes a full-blown nationwide movement. And the strategy changes, right? It moves away from just fighting in the courts to direct, nonviolent confrontation in the streets.
Activists came up with these brilliant, powerful new tactics. You had students staging sit-ins, where they just sit at segregated lunch counters and refuse to move. You had the Freedom Riders, black and white activists together, riding buses into the most dangerous parts of the South to challenge illegal segregation. And they often faced just unbelievable violence. And then there were the massive marches, demanding something as basic as the right to vote.
And maybe the most iconic moment of the whole era was the March on Washington in 1963. Hundreds of thousands of people gathered, and it's where Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his I Have a Dream speech. It was this incredibly powerful vision of what America could be, and it just resonated across the entire world.
But here's something that's really important to remember. The movement wasn't just one single idea. Not at all. You had the powerful philosophy of Dr. King, which was all about nonviolence and integration, but you also had other really strong voices, like Malcolm X, who argued for black nationalism and self-defense. He reflected this growing frustration with how slow change was coming. It created this really important debate right inside the movement itself.
And you know what? That spirit of challenging authority, of demanding change, it was contagious. The civil rights movement's tactics and its moral power inspired all these other groups. By the end of the 1960s, it felt like protest was just part of the American identity.
It was like this giant chorus of dissent. You had students on college campuses protesting the Vietnam War. You had the women's liberation movement fighting for equal pay and reproductive rights. And then you had the whole counterculture, the hippies, who were challenging everything about mainstream American life. It was a decade of massive social upheaval. The anti-war movement especially became this huge, unifying cause. It brought together students, activists, and just ordinary people in some of the biggest demonstrations the country had ever seen. I mean, we're talking hundreds of thousands of people marching on Washington, demanding an end to the war in Vietnam. It really changed public opinion.
So after all this social turmoil and protest, the era ends with one last massive shock to the system. But this one didn't start in the streets. Nope. This one came from the very highest level of power, the White House. This was Watergate. And it was a scandal that would completely shatter the American people's faith in their own government.
It's wild to think it all started with a clumsy break-in at the Democratic Party headquarters. At first, the White House dismissed it as just a third-rate burglary. But as you can see from these protest signs, it didn't stay that way. It unraveled into this massive conspiracy and abuse of power that went all the way up to President Richard Nixon himself.
And you can really see how it all fell apart in these 4 stages. First, you have the actual crime. Then comes the cover-up, a huge effort by the White House to hide their involvement. That leads to these dramatic televised Senate hearings that had the entire country glued to their TVs. And the final step? The President of the United States resigning in disgrace.
And this timeline just drives home how Watergate completely consumed the country. For more than 2 years, from the break-in in '72 until Nixon finally resigned in August of '74, it was the only story that mattered. It paralyzed the government and ended with a president leaving office and a new one, Gerald Ford, taking his place. And this right here, this chart shows the real, lasting damage of this whole period. It's a total collapse of public trust. Look at that. In the late 50s, almost 80% of Americans trusted the government. By the time Watergate was over in 1974, that number had cratered to below 40%. That's a wound that, you could argue, has never really healed. So when you look back at it all, from the paranoia of the Red Scare through the incredible fight for civil rights and ending with the deep cynicism of Watergate, these 30 years completely changed America. And it leaves us with a huge question, one that's just as important today as it was then. What does it really take to form that more perfect union the founders talked about?